My parents had a wonderful and happy marriage, and because of this, my younger days were great. That all changed, however, when my father was KIA in Iraq in 2005. Since my folks had been high school sweethearts at 16, his loss hit my mom very hard. For a long time, she spent most of her days and nights in bed. Luckily, I was already approaching 14 and capable of taking care of myself. Not 1 second did I hold her reaction against her. We all deal with the death of a loved one in our own way. Her long days in bed would end about 9 months after my dad's death, when a friend of my mom convinced her to go out with her to her favorite bar. That day would lead to a long, hard road in which she would almost lose her life, and both of our lives would be forever altered. Within a week, my mom would bring home her first boyfriend. He would become the first of many men she would pair with large amounts of alcohol in a vain attempt to kill the pain of my dad's loss. Over time, her personality would change drastically. She became far harder, and I can't think of one time in which I remember her smiling. Then the day I feared would come arrived. My mom moved in one of the boyfriends. Daryl was a lowlife that worked days at a motorcycle repair place and spent his nights drinking as much as possible. For whatever reason, Mom thought he'd be great marrying material. I guess alcohol does destroy brain cells, just like they say. Anyhow, they got hitched a few months after he moved in, and that's about the time everything started to fall apart. Daryl would show his true self within a week of the marriage. He and Mom stumbled in one night from some bar and began arguing. She said something that made him mad, and he backhanded her across the face. Rather than destroy him that second, she would apologize to him after sobering up the next morning. This was just the reaction he must have been hoping for. The abuse would escalate from that point, and it became normal to see Mom with a black eye or split lip. Despite my begging, she wouldn't get rid of him. I heard the same excuses over and over. He's only mean when he's drunk, and I push him too far when I am. In the end, it's my fault. I eventually gave up and began focusing on saving enough money to get out of the house. Luckily, Daryl ignored me for the most part. He'd said many times that he'd had no interest in being a parent to me, and that was just the way I liked it. Ultimately, the logical result occurred the year after I'd moved out. Daryl and Mom had one of their usual arguments, and this time, he almost took it too far. I would get a call one day at work from the hospital saying my mom had been in a terrible accident. Only when I got there did I find out it was far from an accident. Daryl had beaten Mom so badly that she had died once in the ambulance. A noise complaint from the neighbors was the only thing that saved her. That incident was the one that finally got her to leave him, and with Daryl out of the picture, I moved back in with Mom to help her with the bills. Things were a little rough while Mom healed. Daryl did try to get her to come back to him through text, but she managed to stand fast. Just as it was starting to look as if though she was going to be back on her feet without him, he caught her in a moment of weakness and convinced her to come over just to talk. On her way over, she did the one smart thing that would save her life. That night I was working and received a text from her saying she was heading over to the old house, the one that Daryl was living in. It was clear to me this was a bad idea. Once I managed to fill my boss in on the situation, I raced over to stop her. She was already there when I pulled up outside. As soon as I turned off my engine, I could hear people yelling at each other. I rushed into the house in time to witness my mom jump on Daryl's back. She was punching him on his head, and when he turned around to pull her off, I noticed a big bruise on her face and a bloody lip. It wasn't hard for him to throw her off. She was lying on the floor yelling curses at him. Each word she said was slurred, and this was when I realized she was drunk. Neither of them noticed me at first. They continued yelling at each other. As this happened, I watched Daryl reach into a drawer and pull out a pistol. He fiddled with it for a second and then pointed it at my mom. In her state, she foolishly laughed at him and said that he didn't have the spine to shoot her. A few seconds later, he fired the first shot. The shock of seeing this caused me to scream out, and this was when he finally realized I was there. When he saw me, he grinned and aimed the gun back at my mom. There was no way I could let him shoot her again, so I charged and tackled him. As we fell, a second shot went off, barely missing her. Fortunately, he was so drunk he had dropped the gun, but once he located it, began crawling over to get it. I knew when he had it, he'd shoot me next. Out of nowhere, I yelled out that I'd called the cops and that they were on their way. This was a lie, of course. When he heard this, he stopped and stared at me, trying to see if I was telling the truth. I put on my best serious face, and it must have worked. He reached down and grabbed the gun and helped himself to his feet. I winced when he stood up, but instead of shooting me, he turned around and stumbled out the front door. I quickly crawled over to my mom. Miraculously, she was still breathing. However, she was bleeding heavily. Dialing 911, I was told by the dispatcher that someone had already called in gunshots and the officers were on their way. No more than 3 minutes later, they showed up with the paramedics right behind them. They rushed her to the hospital, and after a long surgery, she survived. Daryl being drunk was probably the thing that saved her life. At the distance she was, he could have easily blown her brains out. When it comes to Daryl, however, he wasn't quite as lucky. The police caught up with him on his motorcycle a few miles from the house. After repeated demands that he drop his gun, he raised it and they emptied their guns into him. The moment I was told was like a load of bricks had been lifted from my shoulders, and I relaxed the first time I had in a long time. I can't pretend that his death made me sad because honestly, I'm glad he's gone. Our life had been a nightmare since he came into it. Once Mom had recuperated, my parents and I convinced her to enter alcohol treatment. It went very well, and she's been sober almost 2 years as of me writing this. Last month was the first time we visited my dad's grave since the funeral, and despite it being a sad day, I think it is a good first step in my mom's grieving process. A process I don't think she's ever managed to complete. However, I believe with a lot of help from myself and the rest of the family, she will be able to finally deal with his loss and learn how to handle it without the booze.